The churchyard at Ashwick lay quiet in the last of the October light, the yew trees standing still and dark against a sky that had gone the color of ash. It was the kind of afternoon that asked nothing of a person, that settled its gray wool over the village and its fields and its cold stone walls and expected no answer. Cecily Vane had come to lay late-season asters on her mother's grave, as she did every fortnight, and she had not expected to find a stranger standing at the plot beside it. He was tall and dressed for travel, a coat that had seen hard roads, boots thick with the clay of some other county, his hat in his hands as if the gesture were an old habit performed without thinking. He was not reading the stone. He was simply looking at it, the way a man looks at something he does not yet understand and does not yet want to. The late light caught the angle of his jaw, the particular set of his shoulders that spoke of recent cold and longer roads, and Cecily had the sensation, standing at the gate with her flowers, of having walked into the middle of someone else's private reckoning. She paused. There was something in his stillness that made her reluctant to disturb it, a quality of arrested motion, as though he had walked a very long way and arrived at this exact moment of stopping. She set her flowers down quietly against her mother's stone, yet the gravel shifted under her boot, and he turned. His face was angular, unguarded in a way she suspected it rarely was. Dark eyes, the kind of deep brown that in low light could pass for black. A jaw that had learned restraint. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two beyond it. A man who had spent some portion of those years outdoors, in weather, doing something that had settled into his bearing as permanence. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the stone. "Do you know," he said, his voice level and deliberate, "whose grave this is meant to be?" Cecily followed his gaze. The stone was new. The cutting was clean, the letters still sharp. She had passed it a dozen times in the past 3 months, and had never thought to question it, because in small parishes, one did not question new graves. People died. Stones were placed. The ground absorbed them. Captain Edward Ashmore, the stone read, died in the service of his country, August 1818. Beloved son of Halcombe Park, mourned by all who knew him. The man beside her said nothing. He only looked. "It is the grave of Captain Ashmore," Cecily said, because silence seemed unkind. "He was killed in the autumn campaign, or so the village was told. His mother had the stone placed in September." The man turned to look at her again, and this time the expression on his face was not confusion. It was something older and quieter than confusion. It was the expression of a man who has been told a story about himself that the world now believes, and who is only beginning to understand what it will cost to change the telling. "I am Captain Ashmore," he said, "and I have not, as yet, been killed." The village of Ashwick had not changed in the 3 years since Edward had left it, and yet nothing in it recognized him. This was the particular cruelty of returning to a place that had decided to mourn you. The world had found a shape for your absence and had grown comfortable inside it, and your reappearance was not a relief so much as an inconvenience. The beeswax candles in the church had burned for him. The entry in the parish register had been made, the stone had been cut and set and weathered these 3 months past, and he had ridden home from the coast in November cold to find himself already buried. He had not gone directly to the house. He had stood in the lane for some time, in the early morning before the village was awake, and looked at the familiar shape of the church tower and the familiar line of the yews, and had thought about what it meant that his home had learned to be without him. Then he had ridden up the drive, because there was nothing else to do. His mother, Lady Ashmore, had received him in the drawing-room at Halcombe Park, with an expression that moved through shock and then grief And then, so quickly it made his chest ache, into something very like calculation. She was a woman who had always thought several rooms ahead of wherever she was standing. She had embraced him, genuinely, he believed. There was water in her eyes that she did not permit to fall. And then she had sat down in her chair by the fire and begun, in the particular manner of women who have managed estates through difficult seasons, to think. "The solicitor will need to be informed," she said after a silence. "There are matters that will have to be reversed." "What matters?" Edward said carefully. "Were set in motion?" His mother's hands were still in her lap. Outside the windows of Halcombe Park, the home park lay under a skin of early frost, the elms bare, the long drive empty. This house had been in the Ashmore family for 5 generations, and Edward had grown up understanding that the house was, in a quiet and inexorable way, more important than any person inside it. He had accepted this as a young man. He was less certain of it now. "We received word in August," his mother said, "that you had died at Badajoz. A letter from your commanding officer. I had no reason to doubt it. The stone was placed in October. And in November, 2 weeks ago, a further arrangement was set in motion." "What arrangement?" "Lord Harcastle expressed his wish to call upon us. His son, Mr. Reginald Harcastle, has been led to understand that with Halcombe's heir gone, the estate might be available for advantageous negotiation. The entail is not unbreakable, as you know. And your cousin Gerald has been cooperative," Edward said. His mother did not deny it. She looked at the fire, and the fire said nothing useful. And she folded her hands more firmly in her lap and said, "Gerald believes he acted for the estate. I think he believed it sincerely, or something close to sincerely." "And what did Gerald believe the estate would do for Gerald, once it was settled?" Another silence. Outside, a wood pigeon called from the elms, the sound carrying very clearly in the cold. There was a matter of certain fees, his mother said, pertaining to the negotiation, as the facilitating party. Edward said nothing. He stood at the window and looked at the park for a long moment. And then he said, "I will need to see the correspondence." The Harcastles had been acquaintances for 20 years, neighbors in the way that large estates are neighbors to one another, which is to say they occupied the same county and attended the same assemblies, and did not, in practice, care very much for one another. Reginald Harcastle was a man of considerable fortune and no particular character, and he had been circling Halcombe the way a man circles a piece of property he intends to acquire, not urgently, but with the patient confidence of someone who believes time is on his side. He had a cousin, Miss Harcastle, who was fair and well-dressed and entirely aware of her value on the season's ledger. He had a solicitor with a careful manner and a tendency to produce documents with great numbers of seals. And then a letter had arrived saying Edward was dead, and patience had turned into action. It was Cecily who told him the rest of it. She did not mean to, precisely. She came to Halcombe Park the following morning with a basket for Lady Ashmore, as she had done throughout the autumn. She was the daughter of the late Reverend Vane, who had been the parish's vicar for 30 years, and she had kept up the small kindnesses of his calling in the month since his death, because there was no one else to keep them up. She was not a servant, and she was not a guest. She occupied the particular invisible position of the gentry's poor relation, present enough to be overlooked, capable enough to be useful, and unremarkable enough in her circumstances that no one thought to ask whether she minded. She had minded, once. She had, at 21, minded quite precisely, and had understood very clearly what the next 30 years of her life would look like if she remained in Ashwick without connections, without portion, without the kind of face that rooms turned toward instinctively. She had minded, and then she had put the minding away in the part of herself she did not open before company, and she had made herself useful, which was a thing the world always had room for, regardless of portion or connections. She did not consider herself unhappy. She considered herself practical. She did not expect to find the dead man standing in the entrance hall. He looked, in the morning light of Halcombe Park, considerably more substantial than a ghost. He was reading a letter with the kind of focused attention that suggested he did not much like what it said. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face settled into recognition. She was the woman from the churchyard. She was, apparently, a regular feature of his house, though he had not known it. "Miss Vane," Lady Ashmore said, arriving from the corridor behind him. "Captain Ashmore has returned." "So I see," Cecily said, and set her basket down on the hall table. He watched her the way he had watched the gravestone, with a quality of attention that she found difficult to name. She was not accustomed to being looked at. She was accustomed to being useful, which was a different matter entirely, and to making herself as quiet as the furniture, which was a skill she had developed over many years, and which the village had come to regard as her defining characteristic. To the season, she was simply the vicar's daughter who had not married. She was pleasant, and she was capable, and she had passed the age of 23 without attracting any particular notice, and the general view of Ashwick was that she would continue in this manner indefinitely, doing good works at a modest scale and making no demands on anyone's attention. She was 24 now. She had her father's library and her father's cold cottage, and the knowledge that the cottage itself belonged to the new vicar, who would arrive in the spring and require it. She had not spoken of this to Lady Ashmore. She had not spoken of it to anyone. Lady Ashmore guided them both into the morning room with the firmness of a woman who believes that difficult situations improve in the presence of tea, and Cecily found herself seated across from Edward Ashmore while his mother poured and spoke of practical matters in a measured voice, and the letter that Edward had been reading was laid on the table between them, like something that had not yet finished speaking. The captain asked her about the village. He asked with a genuine curiosity that was different from the polite inquiries of men who ask because they have been taught to show interest in things they do not actually wonder about. He asked about the school, about the harvest, about the state of the roads since the autumn rains. He asked, after a pause, about her father. Not the polite inquiry after a name he had not quite retained, a genuine question about the man and his work and the village's feeling toward him. She told him that her father had been a person of great kindness and considerable learning, that he had taught her Latin and Greek and had considered this entirely unremarkable, that he had believed very firmly that the proper education of women was not a radical idea, but simply a sensible one, and that he had died in March of a chill that had settled in his chest and refused to leave. She said she missed him more than she had words for, and then felt the faint warmth of embarrassment at having said something so personal to a man she had known for less than a day. Edward said, "I am sorry for it," and meant it, which was unusual enough that she felt the warmth of it for the rest of the afternoon. He asked her, before she left, about the Harcastle arrangement. He was direct about it. He did not come at it sideways or wrap it in social gauze. He said, "You have been coming here since my mother received the news. What did you observe?" She told him what she had seen. Gerald's visits, increasingly frequent through October. The solicitor who had come twice from Northampton. Lady Ashmore's careful silences in the weeks after the stone was placed. The arrival of Reginald Harcastle's card, and then the man himself. Twice. And the way he had walked through the ground floor rooms with the quiet assessment of a man drawing up a mental inventory. She told it plainly, without embellishment. the way her father had taught her to report what she had observed and let the observed facts do their own work. Edward listened. When she finished, he said, "You have a clear eye." She was not certain whether he meant it as a compliment. She gathered her basket and said, "I have a habit of being present in rooms that assume I am not particularly attending." Something changed in his expression then, a very small shift, the kind that is not quite a smile but occupies the same territory as one. He said, "I imagine that has been instructive." "Considerably," she said, and left. If you have ever sat at the bedside of a grief and watched it slowly become something else, you will understand something of what Cecily Vane carried through the weeks of November. She told herself it was nothing. He was a returned soldier, a man of property, a figure the village was absorbing back into its familiar shape, the way water absorbs a stone, slowly, and with a great deal of adjustment on the water's part rather than the stone's. She was the vicar's daughter in the borrowed cottage. There was no reasonable account of the world in which these two persons were anything to one another. And yet he came to the churchyard on the Thursday. She was there replacing the flowers on her mother's grave, as she was every fortnight, and he stood at his own stone for a long time in the gray morning without saying anything. And eventually he said, "Do you find it strange still, that it is there?" "I find it strange that you are not," she said honestly. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to it. He turned back to the stone. "I have written to my commanding officer," he said. "The letter that reached my mother was genuine. A man named Ashmore did die at Badajoz. A private, not an officer. A name recorded in error, the wrong rank attached to it, and the report sent forward without correction. These things happen in war." He paused. "Apparently they also happen in churchyards. Will the stone come down? I am told it is proper to leave it until the registry is formally corrected. The vicar is writing to the bishop." A brief, contained pause. "Your vicar." "Mr. Peggott has not yet arrived," she said. "He will come in the spring." "You are managing the parish business until then?" "Someone must." He looked at her then, that direct, unhurried attention that had unsettled her the first morning in the entrance hall. He did not look away, and she had the sensation, not unpleasant, of being held in a gaze the way a document is held by a careful reader, not glanced at, but read. "You are managing the parish business, tending the sick, carrying baskets to the great house, and doing it all without title or stipend, because you were your father's daughter, and the work requires doing." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "The village," he said, "has not been particularly imaginative in noticing what you contribute to it." It was not a compliment, precisely. It was an observation made in the tone of a man who had been looking at a situation carefully and had reached an accurate conclusion about a fault in the accounting. She found, to her considerable irritation, that her hands were not entirely steady as she gathered her empty basket. She said, "The village does not look, as a general rule." And he said very quietly, "No, I have noticed that." The arrangement with Reginald Harcastle was not resolved quickly or cleanly, because arrangements of that kind never are. They have their own weight, their own inertia, and the men who set them in motion are reluctant to acknowledge that the ground has shifted under them. Gerald Ashmore arrived at Halcombe Park on the Friday, having received word of his cousin's return, and conducted himself throughout the interview with the composure of a man who had not, technically, done anything that could be proven in a court. He had acted in the estate's interests, he said. He had attempted to secure a future for Halcombe in uncertain times. He had, he said, been guided entirely by his sense of duty to the family. He was very glad, of course, that Edward was alive. Very glad indeed. Edward listened to all of this. He sat in the chair across from his cousin and gave him the same quality of attention he gave everything, and Gerald talked for somewhat longer than he had intended to, which was a consistent property of that attention, which had a way of opening spaces that people filled, eventually, with more than they had meant to offer. When Gerald had finished, Edward said, "The correspondence between you and Reginald Harcastle regarding the Tithe Barn field and the mill property will be returned to me today. I do not require an explanation for it. I require only the correspondence." Gerald's composure developed, very slightly, a crack. He left without the fees. The correspondence was returned that afternoon, carried by Gerald's own man with a note that described it as a routine administrative transfer and said nothing else. Lady Ashmore read the note, set it in the fire, and said, "Well," with the particular quiet of a woman who had been waiting for several months for something to resolve, and had found the resolution, when it came, no more satisfying than she had expected. What Cecily witnessed was the assembly at Wyverton, which was the county's first winter gathering, and to which she had been invited by Lady Ashmore with a firmness that made refusal unkind. She had a gown that was 3 years old, and had been retrimmed twice, and was the color of pine needles, which was at least a color that suited her. She was not, she told herself in the glass, without resource. She was simply not the sort of woman that rooms tended to notice, and she had long since made her accommodation with that fact, and found it, if not comfortable, at least familiar. The assembly at Wyverton was held in the county's largest private rooms and drew the neighborhood's most complete attendance, and Cecily arrived with Lady Ashmore and found herself, within a quarter hour, standing near the wall in the place she always stood in rooms of this kind, close enough to observe, far enough from the center to avoid drawing the kind of attention she could not return in kind. The room was full and bright. Candles everywhere, the smell of hot wax and powder, and the particular human warmth of 200 people in a space built for 150. The orchestra played something stately and slightly too loud for the room's acoustics. Miss Harcastle was there in silver blue, a color that set off her fairness to considerable effect, and Reginald Harcastle was at her shoulder with the smooth, prosperous expression of a man who had reoriented his expectations with professional speed and had arrived at the evening with his confidence intact. Edward was speaking to the Lord Lieutenant near the windows, and Cecily watched him from across the room with the particular attentiveness of a woman who has made a private study of a face and is interested in how it manages a crowd. He managed it, she observed, by not performing anything. He answered questions. He asked a few. He stood where he was without moving toward the room's center or retreating from it, and there was a quality in his stillness that drew people toward him rather than pushing them away. The way a clear window draws the eye not because it performs, but because it admits the light without interference. It was Lady Fordham, the Lord Lieutenant's wife, who found her standing near the wall. Lady Fordham was a handsome woman of 60 who wore her opinions with the ease of long habit, and her opinion of Cecily Vane had always been mild and slightly pitying, in the way of women who had found their position early and watched others fail to find theirs. "Still here, Miss Vane?" she said, not unkindly. "I had thought you might have removed to your aunt in Bath by now, with the cottage situation as it is." Cecily said that her plans were not yet settled. "Well," Lady Fordham said with the sigh of a woman performing charity, "I suppose there is always the school. Mrs. Peggott will want help with the younger children in the spring, and a woman in your position cannot afford to be too selective." "A woman in your position?" The phrase settled over the evening like a second gown, one Cecily had been wearing so long she had almost ceased to feel its weight. She had heard it from Lady Fordham, and from Mrs. Peake, and from the Mrs. Throgmorton, and from her own aunt in Bath, who had said it most recently in a letter that had arrived in October and had expressed considerable concern about what Cecily intended to do with herself now that her father was gone and the cottage was promised away. A woman in your position could not afford sentiment. A woman in your position should be grateful for what was offered. A woman in your position had best be practical. She had always been practical. She had been practical for so long that she was not entirely certain. Standing near the wall in her retrimmed pine-green gown, whether she had been practical out of good sense or out of the accumulated weight of a world that had told her, in 100 patient and well-meaning ways, that wanting more than what was offered to women in her position was not practical at all. Across the room, she could see Edward speaking to Reginald Harcastle, and even at this distance there was something in his posture that communicated containment, a deliberate stillness, the kind that preceded action in the way that a held breath precedes speech. Miss Harcastle stood at her cousin's elbow, watching Edward with the composed assessment of a woman who had learned to read rooms, and Cecily watched her watch him, and felt something she had no name for close quietly around her chest. She left the alcove to find a glass of water, and in the corridor outside the main room, Edward Ashmore was standing with his hand on the frame of the doorway, and he turned when she appeared with the expression of a man who had been waiting. "Miss Vane," he said, "I have been looking for you." She stopped. "I have been here." "Near the wall," he said. "Yes. You do that." She was not sure whether she was meant to apologize for it. She said, "I find it quieter. You find it safer." He was looking at her steadily, that same quality of attention he had given to the gravestone and to Gerald's correspondence and to the letter on the mantelpiece, a looking that did not glance away, that held its ground. "You have spent a long time making yourself easy to overlook." Her chin went up a fraction. "I have spent a long time being practical." "Those are not the same thing." He stepped back from the doorway, not quite an invitation, and not quite a withdrawal, something between the two. "Will you walk with me for a moment? There is a terrace. It will be cold, but it will be quiet. And I need to speak to you without half the county watching." She went. She was aware, even as she went, that this was not the action of a woman who was being practical, but something in his voice had made practicality feel, for a moment, beside the point. The terrace was indeed cold, and indeed quiet. The lights from the assembly rooms fell in yellow rectangles across the flagstones. Somewhere across the park, an owl called once and was silent. Cecily could feel the cold through the thin satin of her gloves and through the wool of the shawl she had drawn around her shoulders, and she thought, with a faint irony that was entirely internal and entirely her own, that the women who stood near walls at assemblies generally found themselves standing on cold terraces at the critical moments of their lives, because they were the women nobody had thought to worry about, and so nobody had thought to keep them inside. "Harcastle is going to make an announcement this evening," Edward said. "His cousin and I. His mother has been suggesting it for a fortnight, and he has been moving toward it by increments, and I believe he expects that my situation, the estate, the entail, the question of an heir, makes the match attractive enough that I will not resist the pressure." Cecily said nothing. "I am going to resist it," he said. "I want you to know that before it happens, because I think it is possible that when I do, there will be a degree of public unpleasantness, and I would rather you not be surprised by it." She looked at him in the dark. "Why should I be surprised by it?" He was quiet for a moment. In the cold air she could see the faint cloud of his breath, slow and even. He was not a man who performed thinking, she had learned. He was a man who thought, and then spoke. "Because I intend to say rather more than that," he said. "And I am telling you first, in private, so that you have the option of telling me that I am wrong before I make it public, and one or both of us cannot easily walk it back." Cecily's heart was doing something she would have preferred it not to do in a cold corridor in November, while a man who had been dead since August stood very still in the dark and watched her with those steady, dark, unhurried eyes. She said, "You have known me for 6 days." "I have known you for 6 days," he said. "I have been watching you do more for this parish than the parish knows, in a situation that is considerably harder than the parish notices, with a dignity I have found." He paused. Not the pause of a man who doesn't know what he wants to say, the pause of a man who intends to say it precisely. "I will be specific about this, Miss Vane. Quite impossible to stop thinking about." She was silent. "I am not a man who speaks before he has thought," he said. "I have thought. And I am telling you that if you would allow me to say, this evening, in front of the people in that room, that there is a matter settled between us, I would consider it the most fortunate arrangement of my life." He looked at her. The owl called again, somewhere farther off, and the cold pressed in on both sides of them. And she could feel her own heartbeat very clearly. "I am not asking you to manage my household or to be convenient. I am telling you that I would like to know you better, and that I have not, since I came back from the dead, been able to think of a more sensible way of beginning than this." She stood very still. This was the quality of impossible things. They arrived not with fanfare, but with quietness, and then they waited. And the waiting was the part that undid you. She said, "You should know that I have nothing. The cottage reverts in the spring. My father's library is worth perhaps £40. I have no connections that are useful to an estate. I have no portion and no prospects." "I know what you have," he said. "I have been paying attention." Her eyes were not, she was fairly certain, entirely dry. She made a decision about that, and looked at the lights from the assembly room windows. The warm yellow rectangles in the dark. The figures moving behind them in the warmth. She had briefly left. She thought about a woman in her position, and what that position had meant to the world that had made it, and what it might mean to a man who had come home to find his own name on a stone, and understood, perhaps better than most, that the world's verdicts are not always accurate. "Then I will not tell you that you are wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he offered her his arm. It was, she thought, the most deliberate gesture she had ever been offered. Not performative, not hurried, not colored by any of the calculations that usually attended the gestures of men in drawing rooms. A hand held steady, waiting, with no performance in it. She took it. They went back inside. The room, when they entered it together, did not immediately notice. Rooms rarely noticed the things that mattered until the moment they had no choice but to see them, and for a few minutes the assembly continued around them in its ordinary way. The orchestra played, the groups shifted and resettled, the candles burned. Lady Ashmore noticed, because mothers always do, and the expression that crossed her face was something Cecily had not expected. Not calculation, not the strategic appraisal of a woman who had been managing a difficult estate through a difficult season. It was relief. A private, genuine relief, of the kind that does not want to be observed. Reginald Harcastle stepped forward. He was a man who had been raised to the assumption that negotiations concluded in his favor, and his smile had the particular quality of a man arriving to collect what is already his. He moved through the room with the easy authority of someone who knows himself watched and does not mind being watched. And beside him, Miss Hardcastle walked with her silver-blue composure intact, and the small assembly of county families shifted to allow their approach with the accommodating reflex of people who have long since sorted out who in a room requires their accommodation. "Captain Ashmore," Hardcastle said, with the cordial warmth of a man who has spoken to his cousin and believes the arrangements are in hand. "I had hoped this evening to make a matter of business quite pleasantly social. My cousin and your family have, I think, reached an understanding, and it seemed a fine occasion to mark it before the neighbors." Edward said, "Miss Cecily Vane has consented to become my wife." He said it the way he did everything. Level, deliberate, without amplification. 12 words in the quiet that had opened between Hardcastle's sentence and whatever was supposed to follow it. Not a speech. Not a declaration built for the room's entertainment. A fact placed in the record. The way a man places a document on a table, here. This is what is true, I am not asking for comment. The room turned. It turned the way rooms turn at the exact moment when the thing everyone has been watching without acknowledging finally becomes visible. A slow, collective reorientation. Glances cutting toward Cecily, then to Edward, then to Reginald Hardcastle's face, which had undergone a change that his cultivation was working hard to manage. His smile remained. The ease behind it did not. Miss Hardcastle went very still. She was, Cecily thought, a woman of genuine quality, and whatever she had been told about the evening's likely outcome, she absorbed this revision with a composure that was more than her cousin was managing. Her eyes moved to Cecily once, a single assessing look, not unkind, merely the look of a woman recalculating. And then she directed her attention elsewhere with the smoothness of someone who has been trained since childhood to lose gracefully. Lady Fordham's fan had stilled in her hand. It was Mrs. Peake, the solicitor's wife, who spoke first, a small woman near the windows who had never in her life been known to hold a thought inside her head for longer than it took to move it to her mouth. "But Miss Vane is only—" she began. "Quite so," Lady Ashmore said from her chair across the room, in the tone that had ended arguments for 30 years. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She is precisely so, and has been so this past year, while half this county failed to observe it. There was a silence. It was the particular silence of a room that has been offered a clear and accurate statement, and is in the process of deciding whether to accept it. Lady Fordham looked at Cecily, not the mild, pitying glance of a woman acknowledging a poor relation's continued existence, but a longer, more careful look, the kind that involved actually seeing. Her expression moved through something private. Then it settled into something that was not quite gracious, but was at least honest. She said, to no one in particular, "I had not thought," and let the sentence stay where it belonged, unfinished. The orchestra, which had paused, resumed. People found themselves with glasses to attend to and conversations to return to. Hardcastle recovered. He was a man of the world, and he recovered. And he offered Edward a civil congratulation that cost him something. And Edward received it with the same even courtesy he brought to everything. And the evening continued. Cecily stood beside Edward, who had placed her hand on his arm and had not released it, and felt the strangeness of being seen. Not noticed, not observed with pity or curiosity, or the mild surprise of people encountering a detail they had filed incorrectly. Seen, the specific, deliberate, permanent kind of seeing, that meant she had been witnessed by someone whose witnessing had weight in the world, and that his seeing of her had already begun. In the slow way that these reversals work, to revise what the world saw when it looked in her direction. She was not, she discovered, good at it. She had been invisible for so long that visibility felt like standing in an open field in wind, everything exposed, no wall to stand near. She kept her spine straight and her face composed, because those were things she knew how to do. He said very quietly, "You are all right." It was not a question. It was the same category of thing as come inside and sit down and walk with me. A short declarative that was, if you listened past its surface, something else entirely. She said, just as quietly, "I am learning to be." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was closer to one than anything she had seen from him. And she thought, looking at it, that this was what the room looked like when it began to come down. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow, careful opening. The way a window opens that has been closed for a long time. The stone came down from the churchyard in December, once the bishop's correction had been received, and the parish registry formally amended. It was a cold morning, the first proper frost of the year, laying a white skin across the graves and the yews and the stone wall along the lane. The sexton and his boy worked quietly, and Cecily stood at her mother's grave with her flowers and watched the space where it had been. Edward had come with her. He came often to the churchyard now because the cottage was cold and the vicarage was warmer, and there were matters between them of a practical and domestic nature that required quiet conversation in unhurried places. They had established a habit of the Thursday mornings that Cecily had not quite named and had not quite needed to name, because habits that settle into place without requiring announcement are usually the most durable kind. They talked about the school, about the parish accounts, about the East Wing at Halcombe that had been closed since his father's death and would need attention in the spring. They talked about her father's books, and which ones she had read twice, and which ones she had not finished, and what he thought of Latin, and she thought of the tendency of men to consider Greek a more serious language, without adequate cause. He had kissed her once, in the library at Halcombe, 3 days after the assembly, when she had been returning a volume to its shelf, and had turned to find him closer than she had expected, closer than either of them had quite accounted for. And there had been a moment of stillness between them, the particular stillness that has no rational content, that is nothing but the weight of two people in a small space who are entirely aware of one another. And he had said her name. Cecily. Not Miss Vane. Just Cecily, in a low voice. And then his hand had come to her jaw in a touch so careful it could barely be called a touch at all, and his mouth had been warm and quiet, and there for one moment before he stepped back. She had said nothing. Her heart had said a great deal. He stood beside her now and looked at the bare ground where the stone had been. "It leaves a mark," she said, "in the grass, even when the stone is gone." "It will grow over," he said, "by spring." She looked at the pale rectangle in the frost. She thought of the letter her father had written her in the last week of his life, tucked in the breast pocket of the coat she wore now because it was warm and his handwriting still lived in her hands when she touched the paper. She had taken it out last week and read it, for the first time since March, and had found in it something she had not been ready to find before, his certainty expressed in his careful scholar's hand that she had every quality required to be happy and to make someone else so, and that the world's failure to see this was the world's failure, not hers. He had written it as a simple fact, the way he wrote everything, without apology, without embellishment, as though the statement required no defense, because it was simply true, and he saw no reason to be tentative about true things. She had put the letter back in the pocket, and had not yet told Edward about it. She thought she might. Today. The sexton and his boy finished and moved on to the path, their boots crunching on the frost. The church stood gray and steady behind them, the same as it had been for 4 centuries, absorbing the village's births and deaths and amendments without particular comment. The sky had gone from ash to something lighter, not quite blue, the particular pale luminosity of a December morning that has decided against clouds without quite committing to sun. "I have been thinking about the school," Cecily said. "Mrs. Peggott will still want someone for the spring term. I would like to do it, if that is agreeable." Edward said, "Of course it is agreeable. You need not simply agree with everything I propose." "I am not simply agreeing," he said. "I think you should do it. I think you have been doing the work of 2 people for a year and receiving the credit of none. And I think you should do the work that matters to you and receive the credit of it." He paused. "And I think the children of this parish, who are taught by a woman who reads Greek for the pleasure of it, will be considerably better equipped for the world than their parents were." She looked at him sidelong. The cold air was bright between them, sharp and clean. "You are very sure," she said, "of what you think." "I have been called worse things," he said. Something in his face shifted, the territory adjacent to a smile, closer than before, a little less contained. He held out his hand, not the formal arm-in-arm of an assembly, but simply his hand, open, the way a man offers a hand to someone he trusts to take it. She put her hand in his. The letter from her father rested warm in her breast pocket, the paper soft with handling, his handwriting as familiar as her own. The frost would lift by mid-morning. In the spring, the ground where the stone had been would grow over, seamless with the rest of the churchyard, and no one who had not been present would know what had been there before. She knew. He knew. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been practical for a very long time, and had not until now understood that practicality and happiness were not, in fact, mutually exclusive, precisely everything.